While this book was a theological thriller, he then wrote The Chanakya's Chant, which was a political thriller with roots in ancient Mauryan history. The third in the series was The Krishna Key, which was a mythological thriller. And in fact, all these three novels have seen the topmost rankings in Nielsen's All India fiction listings. In his latest novel, The Sialkot Saga, he actually explores the world that he's most familiar with, which is the world of Indian business. He himself has had 20 years of experience in the field, and he sets it against post-independence India. As we all know, Ashwin has co-authored a crime thriller series along with the American best-selling author James Patterson, and he's also written many books under the non-fiction series 13 Steps. He's been featured by Forbes in their Celebrity 100 rankings, and he's the winner of the Crossword Popular Choice Award. He has been called the Indian Dan Brown, but it's a title that he shrugs off most of the times. There was a line in Times of India which I thought described you perfectly. It said that Ashwin Sanghi loves marrying myth with modern mayhem in parallel narratives to show how the past mirrors the present and the future. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, Ashwin, to know more about your writing, research, Excel sheets, imaginations.
I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, Mohini.
Thank you.
And you're one of the best prepared moderators I've ever come across. 2 emails with a ton of questions in advance. So please, you owe her a round of applause.
Thank you. I'd like to begin today's session by talking about your most recent book, The Sialkot Saga, but not because it's the most recent book. It's because I just found out that he actually wrote parts of this book in Bhutan. Yes. So tell us your connection with the country. Start with.
Well, the connection is sitting right here. The Queen Mother, Her Royal Highness. And frankly, I was here for, I can't remember, I think it was 2 years ago. And I was here for Mountain Echoes. And the Queen Mother said, why haven't you written a book on Bhutan? And I was sitting in my hotel room. We had just passed the Tiger's Nest monastery the previous day. And I was just looking at it. And I said, to my mind, the great Emperor Jahangir said that about Kashmir. He said, if there is paradise on earth, then this is it, this is it, this is it. And that's actually Bhutan, if you ask me. It's a lot of people who look at Bhutan wrongly say that it's almost going back in time. But they are wrong, they are very mistaken. Because actually Bhutan is what the future holds. Because when I just look around me at the world and the scenario that we are heading towards, unfortunately, this is one country which holds out a ray of hope. And maybe at some point of time, we'll realize that we were running after the wrong things. The world in that sense is yet to catch up. So I definitely wanted to make that a part of my story. So for the 4 days that I was here, 3 days were holed up on the balcony of my bedroom, writing in the scenes which dealt with Bhutan.
That's amazing. Such a lovely thought to begin the session with. Thank you, Ashwin. I also wanted to talk a little more about your research for the Sialkot Saga because it's a little different from the other books. It talks more about contemporary Indian history. You've set it in the first 60 years of independence. Yeah. And you bring in characters like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and P.V. Narasimha Rao and Steve Jobs and, contemporary figures who we've all heard and seen. So was that different from, talking about a Chanakya or Krishna?
Not really, Mohini, because at the end of the day, it's storytelling. And, I think I remember a long time ago, in fact, my mother is sitting in this audience, and she will recall that during one of these press conferences, someone asked that, what is your qualification to be a writer? And I said, well, my mother always used to say that I was a damn good liar. And so I have just carried on with that, spinning my web of lies. Now, there is the corollary to that. And the corollary to that is that if you are going to tell a lie, then tell the lie as close to the truth. Because when you tell that lie close to the truth, it makes the lie that much more believable. And that is where research comes in. So you know that you are telling a lie, you're
Seeing
making
a new
a story.
13-step series.
Yeah, you know that you're spinning a web of lies, but if you tell those lies which are very much in consonance with the reality of the world, then it sounds believable. So, to give you an example, Sialkot saga did not involve, for example, Chanakya's chant was reading the Arthashastra, or for example, Krishna Ki was visiting Dwarka or Bet Dwarka and figuring out what was unique about Somnath. But when it came down to Sialkot saga, it was understanding who would be able to fill in those 60 odd years of Indian history. And so it was a series of conversations with people who had lived through those times. So very often at lunchtime, my parents would be wondering, I would be asking them, you know, when you moved to Bombay in 1961 or 62, what was it? Where did you go to eat? Or what was the in place to
Or
go
what were the
go
films
to?
that were showing
Exactly.
on the screens?
So you have to recreate that entire time period. And that only comes through conversations. There's no book which can do that for you.
Yeah, I think, and you've evoked that really well in this novel as
Thank
well.
you.
And coming to the question of telling stories and
Yes.
Web of Lies and all of that, you actually work full time, but you also manage to write in your travel time,
Yeah.
early mornings, weekends, and so I mean, so many people actually just struggle to write, even if it's
Yeah.
full time, or things like writer's block clearly have no place in your life. So how do you manage?
I've
these
always
two worlds?
maintained that there's no writer's block that a peg of whiskey doesn't cure. but frankly, I must tell you, the way I describe myself is that 10 years ago, I was a businessman who was trying to be an author. Today, I'm an author who's trying to be a businessman. So the roles in that sense have slightly altered. Both the roles are very much part of my life. I still go into my dad's work because it makes him feel nice. And in
Is
some
he here
ways,
as well?
and yeah, he's there. And by the way, in some ways, it's also a way of protecting my inheritance, that I'm still around. But
You're a liar. You're quite honest on stage.
but other than that, I'm up very early in the morning. I'm usually up by 5 or 6. Typically, by the time I actually start my day, I'm already done with a few hours worth of writing. And my life in that sense revolves around a set of W's. Writing is obviously my passion. Work, I go in there, as I told you, for a few hours every day to mark my attendance and presence. And then there is, of course, my wife, who makes sure that she keeps my feet on the ground and punctures my balloon when necessary. And then there's the whiskey, which makes all of this writing happen. So, it's pretty much that.
Yeah, that's. You've already answered my next question, which is going to be, what would your advice be to young writers or just new writers who?
Not the whiskey. But anyway, I will.
And just things like how to deal with rejection, how to discipline yourself to write. What do you say is the most important thing that you've discovered?
Okay, I would say probably for anyone starting out on the path of writing, probably the first golden rule is write. There are too many people who think about writing but don't write. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sit down and attempt writing a book. It could be a short story. It could be blog entries. Many people have graduated from being bloggers to writers. So I would say the first step is write. The second part of this entire journey is in terms of being tremendously persistent. Writers by very nature need to be thick-skinned because rejection is part of life. And in fact, honestly, in India, we have that concept of Agni Pariksha. It is trial by fire. When I started out as a writer with my first book, I was rejected 47 times between publishers and literary agents. And I had to, in fact, self-publish the first book. So it's important to remain persistent because there are far too many great writers who don't stay the course. So I would say that's the second piece of advice. The third piece of advice is that, don't get too affected by what people say. You can't please everyone when you write. I see so many young writers getting worked up when they receive a negative review or when a critic tears apart their book in the papers or a bad review appears on Amazon. They take it to heart, they take it personally. You know what? You can't please everyone. As long as you can please the majority, that's fine, you're doing a good job. And so try and please a few more people every time, if possible. And fourth, I would say the most important, in case for some reason you do decide to become a writer, don't lose the day job. Keep the day job going, because it's going to be many, many years before the royalty checks will start flowing in. And finally, 5, in assuming that you are successful and you do make it, retain your humility, keep your feet on the ground, because there's a long, long way to go. Abhi Dilli dur hai.
My next question is around the topics that you write on, which are, history, mythology. And I wanted to ask you what you think is the relevance of history and mythology today. There's so many, there have been so many retellings over the centuries, years, decades. And it's happening right now, and it's really striking a chord with the contemporary reader. So what do you think is striking a chord?
Well, I don't know. I think, let's look at it this way. Mythology in that sense is a set of lies that was packaged and put together by primitive man. And then contemporary man came along and he said, no, I don't accept this. And so he came up with another set of lies. And that set of lies we now call history. So frankly, whether you talk about history or whether you talk about mythology, their fundamental DNA is the same. In India, we never distinguished between our history and our mythology, because I think we understood the fact that whether it was history or whether it was mythology, they were trying to tell us a more fundamental truth. They were trying to point to the core kernel of truth. It was, I think, C.S. Lewis who said that a myth is a lie that reveals a truth. So we never took it to mean anything more than a revelation of a deeper truth. And that's one of the reasons why we started out with 25,000 verses of the Jaya, and that 25,000 verses of the Jaya became 50,000 verses of the Bharat, and that 50,000 verses of the Bharat became 100,000 verses of the Mahabharat. Are you seriously trying to tell me that the Rishis and Munis who added on those passages were simply doing it out of stories that they had heard? Or were they ancient day Ashwin Sanghis who were mixing fact and fiction? So one is that. Second, look at the Ramayana. 300 versions of the Ramayana. And even within those 300 versions, the stories differ dramatically. I mean, if you take, for example, the Valmiki Ramayana, Ram is very much a human being. Certainly no pretensions of being God. By the time you go into Tulsi Ramayana, he has become God. If you look at, let's say, something like the Jain Ramayana, Ram is actually a Bodhisattva. It's called the Lao Ramayana from Southeast Asia. Or if you take, for example, you have the Muslim Ramayana, in which Ram is a sultan. Or you have the Adbhut Ramayana, in which Ram is actually not the one who kills Ravan. It is Lakshman who kills Ravan. So are you trying to then tell me that one of those is the truth? No, we were willing to accept 300 versions of the truth. And that's what's great about the region that we live in, the wider South Asian region, that we have always treated the truth as something which is much, much deeper. And so to that extent, I genuinely feel that the reawakening that we are seeing now in the space of history and mythology is a way of being able to bring those stories back to the fore. Because many of the people who are now reading those stories are not necessarily the ones who heard it from their grandmothers at bedtime. So I think it's a great development.
You know, you brought in the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and I'm just wondering, has mythology at all become dangerous territory to venture into? Because there is a confusion with religion, and
Yeah.
are there fine lines that you set for yourself or boundaries that you set for yourself? And I mean, how would you deal with that?
I can't remember
confusion?
who said it, but it was obviously someone great because that's why we remember what was said. But he apparently went on to say that uh, philosophy is questions that can never be answered, and religion is answers that can never be questioned. And that is the fundamental difference between what I think today's younger authors are trying to do, which is to try and keep religion out of it and explore the philosophical angle. Because no matter what you do, religion and politics will always go hand in hand. And that is, as you rightly put it, a minefield. Um, I would say that to a very great extent, if you can, whenever, at least the way I approach most of my books, particularly the Bharat series, which involve a lot of this sort of stuff, I try and approach the subject with a sense of immense respect. So the moment you approach the subject with a sense of respect, that comes across in your writing. And you generally find that controversy doesn't end up getting created because that tone of reverence is very well maintained. I would say the other part of it is that the books in which controversies happen, those are the ones where the authors want controversy to happen. So, as they say, there is always a spark which makes that controversy suddenly flare up. So, very often you find writers are quite happy to let that happen because it means that much more book sales. And I have never believed in that. My approach has always been that a book should sell because it's a good story.
I also wanted to ask you about your crime thriller series.
Sure.
You have co-authored 2 books and are working on a third with the American author James Patterson.
Not yet working on a third, but we have done 2 books in the series.
Right.
And depending upon our respective schedules, we may end up doing a third. Who can say?
So how different was that experience from writing the Bharat series?
Mohini, I think what with a crime thriller, and particularly when you're working with someone like James Patterson, he has a formula for writing taut thrillers, which will keep you hooked to every page. And to a very great extent, I think it was Lee Child who said, no, that what is a thriller? A thriller is basically a story in which you ask a question at the beginning and answer it by the end. And that's pretty much what one does. I have found that with James, the entire focus has to be on a very, very tight plot outline. So there are, after I wrote these 2 books along with James, people came and asked me, they said, what are the rules? What are the so-called rules for writing these sort of books? And I said, well, if you're going to be writing good crime thriller, which is going to work in terms of readership, probably your first paragraph should be like a pothole where someone falls in and can't get out. So that first paragraph sucks you into the story. And on the other hand, every page or every chapter ends with a hook so that it propels you into the next chapter. So what they call page turners, that you're not turning the pages. The pages are pretty much turning themselves. And finally, the last paragraph should give the reader a sense of contentment. But more importantly, it should make him want to look out for your next book because he says, oh, wow, that was great. So the way I look at it is, if you can do these 3 things, then you've got a crime thriller that works.
And that would be very different from writing your non-fiction series, The 13 Steps.
Very much so. I mean, 13 Steps, honestly, I must tell you, for a lot of the youngsters at the back of this auditorium, that particular book, actually, the inspiration for that book happened at a lit fest like this one. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was happening in Chennai. And someone asked me, they said, what is the reason for your success? And I said, luck. And then I went on to narrate a story at that particular Lit Fest where I talked about my time of rejections, where a lot of people had rejected me. And while I was in that phase, I was sitting at home, and one of my father's friends was sitting alongside him, Punjabi gentleman, and he had his uh, glass of whiskey in his hand. And of course, this gentleman didn't consume regular pegs. They are what is known as Patiala pegs. And Patiala pegs normally means three fingers, but in his case, the three fingers meant this. So it was like a tall glass. And he said, Beta, why are you looking so upset? And I said, I've been rejected by 47 agents and publishers. And he said, well, what's the problem? Find a few more. And I said, but there's no one left on the list. So he said that remember one thing in life, 99% is about good luck. So I said, but what about the 1%? The 1% must be related to hard work. It must be related to effort, efficiency, time management, networking skills, so many more things. And he turned around and he drained his glass, drained the entire glass, slammed it down on the table, and he said, that 1% is known as bloody good luck. So I narrated this story at the Lit Fest, and I went out, and this young girl from the audience, she came following me, and she said, if everything is about luck, then why should I work? I may as well sit at home and watch television. My publisher, Westland Gotham, Padmanabhan, he was standing next to me and he burst out laughing. And he said, I think you need to demystify the idea of luck. That what does it really involve? That is it something which is completely God-given, heaven sent, or is it something that you can actually work on? Can you make yourself, if you can train yourself to be a good public speaker, if you can train yourself to be a mountain climber, can you train yourself to be lucky? And that's how that first book in the 13-step series was born.
And you've completely turned the concept on its head, right? Because all of us use luck as this convenient sort of concept where we say, she got it or he got it because he got lucky.
Oh yeah,
I didn't get it because
there was this wonderful
luck.
little quip by a French actor, Jean Cocteau, and he said, of course I believe in luck. How else do you explain the success of those whom you don't like? Because, it's so important to have that factor in your life.
I'm going to move on to the translations of your books. And
Sure.
just, they've been hugely popular. And did you work closely with the translators to make sure that, there was a certain authenticity in the translation? Do you think it captured what you were trying to do in the English version? How do you feel about it?
By the way, most of my translations are handled by your mother.
Yeah, that's true.
You know that. I'm aware of the fact that the first few books, had it not been for Nita, they would never have got translated. But I must tell you, the thought process was that a story is a story no matter what language you tell it in. So, for example, if I look at my own books in the Bharat series, they have been translated into Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Bengali, and several more translations are still ongoing as we speak. So ultimately, how does it matter? I guess the words become very important when you're talking of poetry. That has the translator been able to convey that sense perfectly? It would be even important where it comes down to probably literary fiction. But when it comes to the sort of storytelling that I do, which is at the end of the day, I mean, for me, words have never been important. My editor, a lady of 75 who lives in Calcutta, whenever my manuscripts go to her, she will very painstakingly remove the word said, because I love that word. So she will take he said, she said, and make it he observed, she remarked, he retorted, she answered, he replied, And then the manuscript will come back to me and I'll again promptly change it all back to said. Because for me, the words are not that important. It's the story. What's between those quotation marks, what the character says, is so much more important than whether I said or remarked or what have you. So that's the way that I approach even my English books. So why would I be too worried about how, what words are chosen for the translations, as long as they convey the story?
I also wanted to ask about that, about when you're writing in English, you're dealing with different time periods, different characters. So would the English of a Chanakya be different from the English used by Atal Bihari
I'm
Vajpayee?
told they used utterly coarse language in the ancient ages. This is the amazing thing, that people come back to me and they say, here you have a character of Chanakya swearing his guts out. And that's strange. I said, are you trying to tell me that all the glorious swear words that our generation uses were invented by us? Of course, they were used at that time also. So, to my mind, what is really important is I am writing for audiences of today in a language which they can understand, as long as I can bring about the atmosphere of that time. Then I've done my job. But I don't think I need to try and write my language to suit audiences of yesteryear, because that's foolish.
And I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll just ask the last question and open it up to
Sure.
the audience for a few
Lovely.
questions. So my last question is around, we talked about translating your books into Indian languages, but what about translating your books into movies?
Yes.
Is there something coming up? Because your books really lend themselves well to, I don't know, a web series or a movie.
In the world of books and movies, we have what is known as an option agreement. An option agreement is basically something that gives a temporary right to a producer or a director to evaluate as to whether he can convert a book into a movie or a digital series. Probably I'm one of the most optioned authors on earth, maybe. And that's because they never get made into movies or series. So the option period expires and I move on to the next. I was at a lit fest, no, not at a lit fest, at an event where the Venerable Wilbur Smith was talking, and then I went up to him later on and I said that, what about your books becoming movies? And he said, can I tell you a secret, son? I said, what? He said, I made more money out of the books that never got made than the books that actually did get made. I said, please explain. And he said, well, the book that never got made got optioned again, and then it got optioned again, and a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time. And I ended up making far more money from the option agreements than I ever made from the actual movies. So I would say that probably in my case, Chanakya's Chant got optioned the moment the book came out. Then a year, 2 years, 3 years passed by with no progress. Now currently Chanakya's Chant has been optioned for a digital series. Sialkot Saga is currently being scripted for a digital series. And Krishna Key is being scripted for a movie. So, but these are all at various stages. So who can say when what will happen?
We look forward to that.
Thank you.
And should we open it up to audience questions? Hand up there.
And there is a lady in the third row also. So we will also take hers after we've finished with that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Her Royal Highness Queen Mother, distinguished guests, foreign dignitaries, and all of you present out here. I'm Shivlal Sharma from the College of Science and Technology under the Royal University of Bhutan, and I'm delighted to meet sir today.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, sir.
Sure.
Actually, I'm also an enthusiastic writer, but not actually a writer, but trying to be a writer, but not with whiskey. My question here is,
good for you.
In the process of writing, sometimes we tend to get stuck up. So how do we move forward with it?
Okay, sure. Great question. I must tell you, I have jokes apart about the whiskey, but I have in so many years never experienced writer's block. And one of my dear friends, Meru, is sitting here in the audience, and she is aware of the fact that in my writing process, I would normally always spend anywhere between 9 months to 12 months on the research, and then another 3 months on what I call plotting. So, for example, if you take, let's say, a book like the Sialkot Saga, it actually started out as a spreadsheet. The book explores the lives of two characters starting from 1947 up to the present day, which means almost about 70 odd years. And so if you look at the spreadsheet, and I've preserved it for future writers to have a look at, so if you email me, I'll be happy to share that with you. But it's basically the first column shows the year. Is it 1947, 1948, 1949? What is it? Then the two characters, there is an Arbaz and there's an Arvind. What were their ages at that time? Then based on their ages, what would they have been doing at that time? Were they in school? Were they in business? Were they trying out their first challenges? Were they experiencing their first romantic involvement? What was happening in their lives? Then what was happening in the country that enveloped them? So what were the social, cultural, political events that were going on at that time? Now, once you have all of that in front of you and you have a storyline in front of you, frankly, the job that you do once you move from that research and plotting phase into a writing phase is actually the same as what a child does with a coloring book. The outlines are already drawn for the child, and then the child needs to use his creativity to decide whether he will put green or blue or yellow or red into the spaces that have already been drawn. And that's what I do. So writing never constitutes a block if you are well prepared. Thank you.
I think Your Majesty has a question.
Ashwin,
Yes, you're right.
you're one of my most favorite authors,
I'm blessed.
and I'm so happy that you have come here for the second time.
Thank you.
Your Chanakya's Chant is my favorite book.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm partial to the Sialkot saga too.
Saga. Okay.
Now, your latest book,
Yes.
which is 13 Steps to Wealth,
Yes.
I don't think you've spoken about it just now, have
Well,
you?
we very briefly touched on
You
13
touched
steps,
on it.
but we didn't get into the individual books.
Okay, perhaps I came in a bit too late. But I went through your book, and I find really very practical, valuable advice for everyone, starting from people youngsters who are earning their first paycheck
Yes.
to the ones who've already made it.
Yes.
How to increase your wealth and how
Yes.
to look after it,
Yes.
and most importantly, how to invest it
Yes.
very early on.
Yes. And if,
So-
of course, I can start actually doing that, I'll be very wealthy one day.
So I just wanted to tell you that this book will benefit everybody
Yes.
who needs to prepare for their futures,
Yes.
young and the ones who are reaching retirement.
Yes.
So you've done a great job with this book, and I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you so much. But I must tell you, one of the reasons for my fascination with Bhutan is because I think this country has shown that wealth is so much more. So, in fact, I'm sort of talking about very mundane things in that book. But when I come to this country, I realize what is the meaning of gross national happiness. And in that sense, I believe that probably my book, 13 Steps to Bloody Good Wealth, is way behind the times because you all are far ahead. Far ahead.
Can I?
I think we
Okay,
have time only
I'm
for
jumping
one
in
more
here.
question.
Hello, I'm jumping in here because I have the mic. I'd like to
Whoever
ask-
has the mic has the way. Please
Yes.
carry on.
I'd like to ask this question of you as a liar rather than as a writer.
Absolutely.
This is the deluge of information today because of social media,
Yes.
and the fact that fact and truth often get completely swamped
Of course.
by information that turns out to be perception or misperception.
Yes.
So what is more important? And and then
Yes.
another one is yes or no answer. I thought mythology is important for its portrayal of values rather than the stories.
Of course. Let me answer your second question first. I genuinely agree with you that probably what mythology is telling us is a deeper truth. It's so rather than taking it completely literally, it's probably more important to search for a deeper meaning. I must. How much time do we have? A minute. So I can end off on this little story for the gentleman. I had walked in. I was in Calcutta on account of an event, and I went into on a tour of the city, and my driver took me to a little temple, very ordinary. I went in there, and there was a green-colored throne, and then suddenly I realized that the person that was being worshipped, the deity that was being worshipped, was actually Amitabh Bachchan, the Bollywood actor. And it had a pair of sandals out there. So there was this portrait and the sandals, and I pinched myself. I said, "Is this real?" So I walked out, and there was this little boy who was selling incense sticks and prayer books. And I bought a prayer book from him, and it was called the Hanuman Chalisa, the Amitabh Chalisa, the 40 ways of praising Lord Amitabh. Now, the point I'm making is that day I realized that what we today call mythology is probably something based on someone who at some point of time was great enough to be written about. I thought to myself at that moment that what, Ashwin, if you were to, at this point of time, be crossing the street, the car knocks you down, you reincarnate 1,000 years later, and 1,000 years later someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Do you think that Amitabh could have been a real man?" That's the question we ask ourselves about all our great mythological heroes. So whether it comes to fact or fiction, both are equally important, because fact is something which very often what we treat as fact is something which we have now decided to treat as fact. There is the old proverb which says history is written by the victors. How much of our history can we actually believe? In fact, honestly speaking, I would say that I believe our mythology far more than our history. I hope that somewhat answers your question. I have a habit of going off on a tangent.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're running short of time, but just thank you so much, Ashwin, for all your refreshing insights on writing, history, mythology, and just like
Thank you,
such a fun
Mohini.
session.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness, and Tashi Delek, everyone.